In this video, I'll be demonstrating how to apply a cloth texture in Blender. As can be seen here, this texture has holes in it that allow light to pass through. You can see the shadow of the texture here. For this video, I'll be using Blender version 2.74. I'm going to be applying the texture to this cloth mesh that I made during a previous video. I put a link to the video in the video description in case you want to see how it's made. During this video, we'll be switching between edit mode and object mode. When we do this, the cloth mesh can lose its shape, which would then require us to run the cloth simulation again. To prevent it from losing its shape, we can bake it. To do this, make sure that the cloth is selected, and then click on the Physics button. Then open the Cloth Cache section, and click the Current Cache to Bake button. This will protect the shape of the cloth. Later, if you want to make changes and run the cloth simulation again, you'll need to click the Free Bake button first. Next, come up here and make sure that Cycles Render is selected. Then from the Screen Layout menu, select Compositing. Click on the Shader Nodes button and make sure there is a check mark next to Use Nodes. To give myself more room to work, I'm going to close the Properties panel by pressing N. This project is currently set up using a Glossy shader, but let's change it to a Diffuse shader. So select the Glossy shader by right-clicking, and then press X to delete it. Now press Shift-A and select Shader, and then Diffuse. Then connect it to the surface input. I'm going to set the color to red. Now let's add an image texture to the displacement input. So press Shift-A and select Texture, and then Image Texture. Then connect the color output to the displacement input. This will use the image to create the impression of depth on the cloth surface. It won't change the geometry, but the surface will appear to have more detail. Now we need to select an image. I'm going to use this photo. You can find a link to it in the video description. The darker parts of the image will appear as lower parts on our cloth mesh, and the lighter parts will appear as raised. To select the image, click the Open button. Before we can use the image, we need to UV unwrap our cloth mesh. So come down here and press Tab to enter Edit mode. While in Edit mode, you'll see the cloth mesh as it was before the cloth simulation was run. Next, press A once or twice until the whole mesh is selected. Then press U and select Unwrap. Over here on the left, open the drop-down box and select the cloth image. Now we can see our cloth mesh overlaid on top of the image. You can control the size of the image on the mesh by scaling the size of the mesh. I want the image to appear 5 times smaller, so I need to scale the size of the mesh up by 5. So I'll press S, then 5, then Enter. Now press Tab to return to object mode. If I were to render the image now, this is what it would look like. I'm going to switch to render view down here so that we can get a better look at what's happening. Next, we're going to add a math node so that we can control the strength of this texture. To do that, press Shift-A and select Converter and then Math. Then drop it on the connection between the color output and the displacement input. Then set the math type to multiply. Now this value can be used to set the strength of the displacement. I'm going to use a value of 2. Now let's make some holes in the texture. If we look at the image that we're using, we can see that it's dark in between the weave of the cloth. This is where we're going to make the holes. So we need to add a few nodes. So press Shift-A and select Shader, and then Mix Shader. Drop it on the connection going into the surface input. Now press Shift-A and select Shader, and then Transparent. Make sure that the color is set to the maximum white color. Then connect it to the bottom shader input of the Mix shader. Now press Shift-A again and select Converter and then Math. Set the math type to greater than. Then connect the image texture's color output to the bottom input. Then connect the output to the mix shader's factor input. Now whenever the image is lighter than this value, the red shader will be selected. Whenever the image is darker, the transparent shader will be selected. So you'll need to experiment with this value to get the look that you want. I've found that a value of 0.2 works well for this image. Here's what it looks like. You can see the holes in the texture here and the shadow of the texture here. Now let's make some changes to the cloth material that will help make it look more realistic. Let's start by adding a mix shader. So press Shift-A and select Shader and then Mix Shader. Drop it on the connection going into the other mix shader. Now press Shift-A and select Shader and then Glossy. Connect it to the bottom shader input. Then set the roughness value to 0.1. The diffuse shader will be used to set the color of the cloth, and the glossy shader will be used for the reflections. So keep the glossy color set to white. Now press Shift-A and select Input and then Layer Weight. Connect the facing output to the factor input. Then set the blend value to 0.2. This will cause the edges that are angled away from the camera to be more reflective by using the glossy shader. Now let's render a higher quality image. So I'll save the project first. Next, switch back to the default layout and click on the Render button. I have the number of render samples set to 2000. Now click the Render button. I'm going to pause the video until it's done. The image is done rendering now. To save the image, press F3 or click the Image menu and select Save as Image. Well, that concludes this video. Thanks for watching, and please subscribe and leave a comment.